Welcome, this is Dr. Kirsten Brown, and I will be talking about the alignment of your research study today. I think students tend to struggle with making sure that all aspects of their research study are connected and fit together well. And so it's kind of the analogy I like to use is it's kind of like putting together a puzzle but without the box that tells you what the picture is like. And so if you enjoy problem solving, you're going to find that research is really fun for you. And so if we think about our puzzle box, right, we don't have the picture of what this is supposed to look like, but we do have a sense of how puzzles work and that the pieces need to fit together and that they need to fit together in a unique capacity. So each piece is only going to go in one spot. And we can pretty quickly tell when pieces don't actually fit together because you're having to force them to shove the pieces. And we also know that there's a border around the puzzle. And so we can ascertain without the picture that certain pieces are going to be corner pieces or certain pieces are edge pieces. The problem-solving component happens in trying to make all of the parts fit correctly without having that template, that pattern. And so I think that's a little bit of an analogy for how students address the alignment of their study. And this is something that, just like puzzles or any other skill, you get better with at time. And so the more time you spend on the process, the faster you'll become, the easier you'll see where the pieces should go, how the pieces should fit together, and fairly quickly you may not actually need the box at all. So when we're thinking about components of your study that need to fit together, the research problem, relevant literature, your purpose of the study, the questions, the approach you're going to take, your specific design, and your data collection all need to work together and connect together and fit or align. So when we look at the research process, there's essentially a template that all studies follow, and in particular your dissertation specifically will follow. And at the end of this video, we're briefly going to review the dissertation template so you'll see how all of these components fit into chapter 1 of the dissertation. But the first component is the research problem, because that's really where we start. And this is going to provide, the research problem provides us with focus and structure. It's usually fairly broad, and the process that a lot of students go through is to narrow and define and refine the research problem. After we have that, we're going to move on to deficiencies or limitations in the past literature, so the published studies about this topic, and then moving into our own purpose statement, and then funneling down to your specific research question. So we're going to take each of these parts individually. When we look at the research problem, and I will say that this is a space that's a little confusing for students in that the vocabulary changes depending on the book that you're using. So GMA uses research topic. Creswell uses the term research problem. I'm going to stick with Creswell's phrasing as well as the dissertation template phrasing, which is research problem. So our problem is going to be something that provides us with structure, a little bit of direction. Typically, the initial version that students look at is usually too broad, too complex, not really doable. And so we want to narrow that scope and try and make it a more manageable size. I find that students, a bulk of 801 and 830 to some extent is really this narrowing process. People typically find research topics in a variety of ways. Usually, particularly with practitioners, they're finding topics that through personal experience, whether that's their teaching experience, their administrative experience, or their own experience as being students. Other spaces that people find research problems within would be theoretical frameworks. So prior existing theories that we have. Library searches are really great and an important part of developing a research problem. And in particular, when doing a library search, reviewing peer-reviewed research journal articles for what's termed areas of future study or areas of future research. So pretty much every single empirical journal article is going to have a section towards the end saying, future studies should examine these 3 things, blah, 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 blah. And that's a really good place to actually go find or narrow down research problems. So what makes a research problem good? Good research problems, first and foremost, need to be interesting to you because you're going to spend at least a year of your life on a dissertation, so it might as well be something that you're interested in. Research problems need to be engaged within the literature, and what this means is that you can't just say, oh, this is a problem because I know it anecdotally from my own personal experience. Research problems need to be connected to existing peer-reviewed journal articles on the topic, which means that you as the student need to go read and immerse yourself within prior research studies about this. Although there might be opinion pieces or thought pieces or blogs or books about certain topics, that's not necessarily engaging with peer-reviewed research, and research problems need to be really grounded within the space of what's been produced before them. Those other types of reading can act as contextual support, but they are not truly engaged within the research literature. Research problems need to be actually researchable, and so what I tend to say is, and this comes out of GMA as well, should questions cannot be answered by a research. So a should question might be, should prayer be allowed in schools? Should abortion be legal? Should I have tea for dinner tonight? Or should I open the bottle of wine? All of those questions are someone's ethical stance and not researchable. Now, you could change that question to make it a research question. So, for example, a way to change what beverage should I have tonight for dinner, you could ask a survey question about people's behaviors, saying so you could send out a survey saying, what beverages do you typically have with dinner? And then offer them a variety of options and see what they select. But you can't ask people for their opinions on what they should do. Other components of good research problems, they need to be ethical. So you cannot have research problems that are causing harm to others or putting others at undue risk. And you really want to be careful with folks that are within protected populations. And then for the purposes particularly of your dissertation, a research problem needs to be manageable. So you probably have a full-time job and a family and a lot of other commitments. And although you could think up and dream up an amazing study that might take you 10 years to complete because you want to do longitudinal data, you also need to graduate. And so this needs to be a manageable problem that can be tackled within the scope of your doctoral studies. If you're interested in doing research beyond that scope, that's great. Do it after you graduate. So, with research problems, they're important because certain types of research problems equate to or connect with specific approaches. So, a research problem that has a quantitative approach associated with it is going to have specific variables of interest. And we typically would see that problem identifying factors that influence an outcome or seeking to determine if an intervention is effective or trying to predict an outcome. Okay, so for example, a quantitative approach, I might be interested in alcohol consumption during someone's first year of living in a residence hall. And a quantitative approach to that, I might seek to try and predict which students might vomit on Friday night. Okay, so that's a quantitative approach. A qualitative approach, a qualitative research problem, is really going to be more of an exploratory approach. So this is appropriate when the concept needs to be understood or explored more. We don't know a lot about it. You don't really know the variables that are important to examine or that could be used to predict something. Or you want someone's story. You want to understand their lived experience. Mixed methods approaches are appropriate for research problems that require a higher order synthesis and are types of questions that you really can't get a good answer, an adequate answer, if you're using just a quantitative or just a qualitative approach. And I think Sarah Goldrick-Grab's work on financial aid and college students, and also housing insecurity, food insecurity, is a really nice example of this. So in her recent book, Sarah talks about how they originally had collected quantitative data trying to understand why students, drop out of college, and how programs like the Pell Grants, so free money, how grants may or may not help students to complete their college education. And so quantitatively, what Dr. Goldrick-Grab found was that actually for some students, grants do not, so if you give a student free money, a grant for $5,000, that money did not necessarily translate to greater odds of that student staying in school and graduating. And you think, wow, well, gosh, the student's being given, quite a bit of money to stay in school. What's going on? Is this person just not capable of learning? Is school not the right thing for them? Are they not mature enough? Are there other factors at play here? What is the $5,000 not enough? Like, what's going on? And so that was the quantitative component of it. And Dr. Goldrick-Grab's team went and did some more investigating from qualitative capacities and asked students, gosh, you're getting this financial aid package, but you're not staying in school. What's going on? And what her work really shines the light on is that the politics of financial aid disbursement. So how the grants are dispersed, what the grants can be used for, and when the grants come within the academic year, really affected students' abilities to stay enrolled and to graduate. And in particular, it was very small things like not having enough money for gas, inability to use the grant to pay for housing, that caused students to not continue with college. So the actual administration of the grant, that process was prohibitive to the intended outcome of the grant. And Dr. Goldrick-Grab's team never would have gotten to that type of finding, that richness of data, if they had not employed both quantitative and qualitative approaches in their study, in their research. So let's look at some examples of research problems. And so this is a study that I published a couple of years ago. And the first thing that I want to point out here is the engagement with the literature. So this entire paragraph is grounding the topic within the existing literature. So I, here in this particular study, I'm looking at the prevalence of sexual assault and students with autism spectrum disorders. And what the existing literature tells us is that rather than focusing on that prevalence of sexual assault, The existing literature describes risk factors for assault, and in particular, risk factors including lack of a sexual knowledge, the mistaken belief that individuals with disabilities and ASD in particular are asexual, or don't have the social skills in order to engage in relationships, the challenges to provide sexual education for individuals with autism, particularly in community settings. So the need to use very concrete language when doing sex education, and that relationship between the lack of actual knowledge and increased victimization. So the literature is talking a lot about risk factors, but not actually telling us how many people with ASD are sexually assaulted. So what's the prevalence here? So that's the grounding in the background in the literature. The next component of this is going to be the gap that I'm articulating, which is without a better understanding of unwanted sexual contact, practitioners and scholars really have little knowledge to draw on and support the significantly growing number of students with ASD and other disabilities. So this is the framing of the problem. And then I get down to the actual research question itself. So in this example, I've taken you from a very broad topic through the literature down to a gap and then the research question. When we think about that next component, that next circle in our funnel, the deficiencies in the past literature is really important to establish. We can't just say, and this is very, very common, particularly in students' early writing, they just say nothing is known about this. And you can't simply do that. You must show the reader. You have to demonstrate to them little is known about this topic by describing what previous research studies have found out about said topic. And it's very, very helpful if you're able to actually cite someone who has said, we don't know much about X thing. So the gap within our knowledge base is the reason why you're going to do your study. And it's the so what of your study. So really, why should people outside of your very small corner of the world care about this topic? And I like to kind of frame this as in relation to my grandma. And my grandma knows absolutely nothing about educational research. She knows that I've been in school for a long time and now I teach something. So when you are talking about the deficiencies in the literature and the significance of your study in relation to that, you really need to keep in mind that you have two separate audiences. You have one educational audience, and that audience might understand at least 50% of the jargon that you're using. And then you have the public audience, or my grandma. And you really need to be able to know your topic well enough to explain that limitation, that deficiency, in language that my grandmother would understand. So the next component of our funnel is the purpose statement. And the purpose statement is so critical that it gets its own section in the dissertation located in chapter 1. And so typically the way this goes, and it flows, is that we show through citation of existing literature that there's a gap in our knowledge, that something is important, and then we follow that up with the purpose of the study is to blah, blah, blah. And that is to address whatever gap you've just articulated. And Creswell 2014 offers several scripts for quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods approaches. And so the scripts are going to be slightly different. So I'm not going to cover the script in detail in this lecture, but I would strongly encourage you to read that and use it as a template. Moving on, research questions. Research questions are size pieces. Research questions need to be doable. They have to align with your theoretical and conceptual frameworks, the specific approach that you're going to employ, the tools you're going to use, the data you are able to collect. Research questions need to be measurable and specific. Creswell does a really nice job of offering scripts for research questions and templates of them, and we'll spend a little bit more time looking at some examples. When we think about research questions, quantitative research questions look different than qualitative or mixed methods ones. So each of these approaches has a different style of research question. Quantitative research questions include the variables of interest. So you actually need to specifically name and in some cases operationalize the variables you're looking at. Quantitative questions fall into three broader or larger categories. Quantitative questions usually describe, address a relationship, or have posit a causal link. In the world of education, it's very difficult to have causal studies because we don't actually get to do experiments due to ethics. I can't take this class and say, oh, I wonder if there's a cause and effect relationship between me providing students with my notes and them getting better grades. So what I'm going to do is take this class and randomly assign half the students to get my notes and half the students to not get my notes. And at the end of the semester, we'll see which ones had better grades. That's not ethical. So a lot of the time, we are kind of doing quasi-experimental, quasi-causal research or relational research. Quantitative research questions have a hypothesis. They also have very clear independent and dependent variables. And in some cases, they also have what's called a control variable or control variables. On the other hand, qualitative research questions are going to talk about the topics that are going to be explored. And qualitative research questions usually have three general purposes: to explore, to understand, or to identify patterns. Qualitative research questions do not generally test a hypothesis, so you are not writing hypotheses for qualitative questions. What may happen later on down the road is that you could use qualitative research to come up with or generate your own hypothesis that someone else could later on test with quantitative. Mixed methods research questions are higher order synthesis, meaning that they are questions that could not be answered solely from a quantitative or qualitative approach. Typically, very early on, students write mixed methods questions that happen to be a quant question plus a qual question, and they're two individual questions. And so I'll encourage students to revise that to create a single question that merges both the quantitative and the qualitative components in a broader, more higher ordered type of thought, so more abstract, and then there may be sub-research questions under that abstract process. When we're looking at research questions, the language that you use to write a research question needs to match or fit with, align with the approach, quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods, and the specific design. So for example, narrative, survey, phenomenology. This is, Creswell provides a really nice cheat sheet on page 141. And this is kind of a summary. So typically errors that I see students making very early on in the process is that they are very invested in taking a qualitative approach. And they are most likely doing either narrative or case study. But the research questions ask about predicting something, or the research questions seek to prove a relationship between math anxiety and math performance. Well, you cannot actually do that. That's not aligned if you're going to use a qualitative approach. If you're interested in a relationship between variable 1 and variable 2, then that's a correlational study and that's quantitative. So it's important to make sure that the language that you're using to ask the research question matches the approach and the specific design that you want to take. When we look at research questions, there's basically two formats for writing a research question. One is a central question, which happens to be broad, and then the second format is associated or sub-questions, which are more narrow. Typically, qualitative studies have a large central broad question or a couple, maybe two central broad questions. They may or may not have sub-questions. Very frequently, quantitative studies have an associated or sub-questions underneath the broad central one. Although for the purposes of a dissertation, I'm going to suggest no more than 5 sub-research questions. So what's this look like? Returning back to the prior example I had about autism and unwanted sexual contact, the specific research question that we used in this study is, what is the prevalence of unwanted sexual contact for college students who identify as a person with a disability and 2 comparison groups, college students with other types of disabilities and college students without disabilities? So looking at this, that term prevalence should key you that this is a quantitative study. All right, and that I'm looking to describe or put forth the rate of occurrence for something. So that is going to be a descriptive statistic. And then the comparison component of this is going to result in some tests of difference. Okay, this is a single research question coming from a short journal article. It is not a dissertation length study. But I think it's instructive to kind of see just what a single question would look like. This is from a different study that I have published, and this is an example of where we have that broad overarching research question and then 3 sub-questions. So the broad overarching research question in this study is interventions. So I'm investigating interventions that post-secondary student institutions use to support students with autism. And within that, 3 research questions or sub-questions shaped the study. First, what types of reasonable accommodations, general support services, and ASD-specific support services are institutions offering? Question 2, are there differences? Question 3, what factors predict? So again, this should sound very quantitative to you. The third example I would like to offer is from a qualitative study. And so this one is very, very simple in that we basically said 3 questions guided the research. What factors influence? How do those factors influence? How are those factors similar or different? And so this is a qualitative approach that's much more open-ended. I'm not specifying what the factors are at all. I'm simply exploring, seeking to understand the situation. So, and these 3 questions happen to be related, but they're not actually nested in any specific order, which would present a hierarchy of one needing to be answered before the other. So how does this connect to your dissertation? Well, if we look at the outline of your dissertation, you're going to see in chapter 1 that there's an introduction. Then you have a problem statement, a purpose statement, your theoretical conceptual frameworks, the significance of the study, and the summary. Within that purpose statement, you will embed the research questions and provide a detailed rationale for the particular method or approach that you are going to use. So these things directly fit in your dissertation within the first chapter. Common problems that students experience, particularly students who are new to the research experience. Alignment. What does this actually mean? So students are like, I don't understand. What do you mean this doesn't align? This doesn't fit? Well, what we mean is that the specific method or tools or a theory or even a review of the literature is not fitting together in a organized format so that one builds off of and informs the other. Typically, one of the common areas where alignment problems happen is that students tend to use quantitative language to describe a qualitative approach or method. So I think this happens because there's a lot of rhetoric in testing and assessment within education, but a lot of students are actually interested in doing a qualitative dissertation. So they're spewing out these words that they've previously gotten from, different spaces in life, but they are not really interested in using quantitative methods for their dissertation whatsoever. So an example would be that of a language problem that I see is that a student wants to predict principal success. So a student's going to want to predict whether or not a principal is successful. But in order to figure out if the principal is successful or not, they want to take a narrative approach and do interviews as their data collection. Well, that's really not going to work because a narrative approach helps us understand why people behave in specific ways, but it won't allow us, and interviews won't allow us to predict anything. In order to predict something, you need continuous quantitative data and to run a regression. Another common problem that students have is the use of very vague terms. So, for example, students might be interested in the relationship between principal leadership and student success. However, we don't actually know what principal leadership is. So the term relationship here means that it is a quantitative term, and it's associated with a specific technique called the correlation. But how are we defining, operationalizing, and measuring principal leadership? And what is student success? Is student success grades? Is student success test scores? Is student success advancing to the next level in school? Is student success being college and career ready? What is success? Is success unique and individual for each student? So I want to actually give an example of a common alignment problem. So the research problem that the person has posed in this example is trauma in schools, and in particular, the review of the literature that has been written is really focused on students that experience trauma and what percentage of students are experiencing trauma and what does trauma look like for students, and what's the free and reduced lunch plan percentage within the particular district, and a lot of stuff like that. The theory, the conceptual framework that the student is using talks fairly substantively about trauma and how to understand students' experiences of trauma. The gap within the literature that the author, that the particular student is citing here is saying, author 4 said this, author 5 said this, author 6 said this, 6 said this, and they indicated that we don't know what supports or discourages teachers' desires to participate in trauma-informed professional development. So the purpose of this study is to understand how trauma-informed professional development affects student success. And the research questions are, what do teachers think about trauma-informed professional development training? And the method is we're gonna survey a bunch of teachers in CESA 5 or 7 or whatever. So some of the issues with this study, the first component is that the research problem really does not connect with the purpose of the study. So the research problem is called trauma in schools. And a lot of the literature is looking at the student's experience. But the purpose of the study, as identified down here, and the research questions are really focused on professional development around trauma. And that's a different topic. So what you need is, in this case, you need a research problem that is focused on teacher preparation to address trauma in the classrooms. And so the example in red is a research problem that is actually going to match or align with the purpose of the study. All right. The review of the literature, although it's important to understand a bit of background about students and their experience of trauma, the review of the literature also is going to need to include prior research on professional development, because what we're looking at here is understanding trauma-informed professional development. Similarly, the theoretical framework that informs our work actually needs to be about people's use of professional development. Why do they seek it out? Why do they participate? Why do they not participate? You could have a little bit of a combination, so maybe there is actually work out there that looks at professional development and trauma. Professional development, that would be ideal if someone had that theoretical framework, but that's pretty specific, so it might not happen. And then our research question needs a much greater level of specificity. So what do we mean by trauma-informed professional development training? Is that in-district training? Is that out-of-district training? What do we mean by teachers in this particular sense? Are we looking at K-12 teachers? Are we looking at middle school only? Who is a teacher? So are teachers aides teachers? When we think about professional development and teachers, what constitutes trauma-related professional development? So there's a whole host of things that need to be specified and have a little bit greater attention to detail in this particular example. This is an example of a study with stronger alignment. So the research problem here, students with disabilities have a lower college completion rate than their non-disabled peers. And we know that the U.S. Department of Education labor statistics indicates that disabled people are 6 times more likely to be under or unemployed in comparison to non-disabled peers. Our review of the literature is going to examine prior research factors that affect graduation rates of students with disabilities. We are going to use Tinto's model on student retention, and that model looks like this. And since Tinto's model on student retention is not disability specific, was developed without engaging the disability population in any capacity, it's not appropriate to simply just apply that model to a minority population. And so we're also going to take in and use a Evans and Brito's interactionist model of disability and create a conceptual framework that has both of those capacities. The gap within the literature that's articulated Current models of graduation, as shown within Tinto's work, don't take into account disability-specific factors. So, for example, what happens if a student needs to take only 12 credits a semester versus 16 so that they're able to cope well with their learning disability? What happens if a student has physical health related issues and has a health crisis in the middle of the semester and needs to drop, either a semester completely or two classes? So those disability-specific factors are not taken into account. So the purpose of the study is to understand the role of disability status plays in time to degree. And questions that a research question you could ask regarding that would be, how do functional limitations associated with disability affect time to degree? Now I've left the method open because there's actually, the way this is written, there's two different ways that you could go. You could go a quantitative way, and if you were going to go a quantitative route, then you would want to go back and take a little bit closer approach to defining key terms, like what do we mean by time to degree, what's a functional limitation, those types of things. However, I think I would prefer to take a qualitative approach to this question, and that means that in particular, I'd like to interview people. And so that means that I'm probably going to be using one of the 5 qualitative approaches that we'll be covering in this class, and using interviews as a primary means of data collection. And then the so what question. So why is this topic important? Well, extra tuition costs money. And so if you're here in college longer, it's costing you more money. And it's also deferring potential for earned income in the labor market. If people won't graduate, we have lost workforce potential. And we go back to that unemployment and underemployment statistic at the top as to why this study is important and meaningful. So I hope that this lecture has helped you see some of the alignment issues associated with doing some research. And we will end with a very cute picture of my little baby.